When an avoidant says, I need space, but I don't want to lose you, most people misinterpret it. They hear rejection, they feel distance, and instinctively they prepare for abandonment. But if you understand the psychology behind those words, you begin to see something very different, something far more meaningful. You're not hearing indifference. You're witnessing conflict. Avoidants are wired to associate closeness with a loss of control. For them, intimacy doesn't immediately feel safe, it feels overwhelming. It activates a deep, often unconscious fear that they will be consumed, judged, or trapped. So their instinct is to create distance, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to regulate the intensity of what they feel. Now here's where it gets important. An avoidant who truly doesn't care will simply disappear. No explanation, no emotional risk. They'll detach cleanly and move on because that's their default defense mechanism. It's efficient, it's protective, and it keeps them in control. But when they say, I need space, but I don't want to lose you, they are doing something that goes against their very nature. They are staying connected while admitting their need to step back. That's not avoidance, that's an attempt at balance. It's a sign that, for once, they are not running blindly from emotion. They are trying to manage it. Think about what that requires internally. It requires awareness, the ability to recognize their own emotional limits. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to admit that you matter enough to be afraid of losing. And it requires effort, the decision to communicate instead of disappearing. That combination is rare for someone with an avoidant pattern. You see, love doesn't always look like closeness, especially not in the beginning. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like distance paired with a quiet pull back toward you. And in this case, it looks like someone standing at the edge of their comfort zone, trying not to retreat completely. They are essentially saying, I feel something here that I don't fully understand, and it's intense enough to scare me, but not strong enough to make me walk away. That's not weakness. That's the early structure of emotional investment. And if you respond to that moment with pressure, with ultimatums, or with emotional escalation, you confirm their fear that closeness leads to overwhelm. But if you understand it, if you hold your own ground without chasing or withdrawing completely, you create a space where they can begin to associate connection with stability instead of chaos. This is where real influence happens, not by forcing closeness, but by allowing it to grow without threat. Because what they're revealing in their own guarded way is that you've already crossed a line most people never reach with them. You've moved from being optional to being significant. And significance for an avoidant is dangerous territory. It challenges their identity of self-sufficiency. So they ask for space, but they also ask indirectly for you to stay. And if you listen closely, what they're really saying is this: I'm not ready to meet you where you are yet, but I don't want a life where you're not there at all. That's not a dismissal. That's the beginning of attachment, expressed in the only way they currently know how. And understanding that distinction changes everything. Because real connection isn't built on perfect expressions of love, it's built on recognizing love even when it shows up imperfectly. And sometimes the most honest form of love you'll ever hear is wrapped inside uncertainty, fear, and a simple conflicted truth. I need space, but I don't want to lose you. When an avoidant looks at you and says, I'm not used to this, but I'm trying, you have to understand the weight behind those words. On the surface, it sounds simple, almost casual. But psychologically, it's anything but that. It's a disruption of their pattern. It's a moment where conditioning meets intention, and intention chooses to stay. Avoidants are not people who naturally lean into emotional growth through connection. Their entire framework is built around self-reliance. They learned, often very early, that depending on others leads to disappointment, pressure, or loss of control. So they adapt. They become efficient at detaching, at minimizing needs, at convincing themselves they're better off alone. And then you come into their life and something doesn't follow the script. They start feeling things they can't easily categorize. A pull toward consistency, a curiosity about emotional closeness, maybe even a sense of comfort in your presence that contradicts everything they've trained themselves to believe. And that's where the tension begins, because now they're navigating unfamiliar internal territory. So when they say, I'm not used to this, they're not making an excuse. They're giving you context. They're letting you see the gap between who they've been and what they're starting to experience. That gap is uncomfortable. It creates uncertainty. It challenges identity. But the second part is what matters most. I'm trying. That word trying is where love begins to take shape in an avoidant, because effort for them is not automatic. It's deliberate. It requires overriding instinct. It means they're choosing to stay present in situations where every part of them is quietly signaling to withdraw. They're choosing to communicate when silence would feel safer. They're choosing to engage when distance would feel more natural. And here's the distinction most people miss. You don't measure an avoidance feelings by how naturally they show up. You measure it by how much they're willing to go against their own conditioning to remain connected. Anyone can show up when it feels easy. That's not where depth is proven. Depth is revealed when showing up feels unnatural, when it requires conscious effort, when it forces someone to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. So when they say they're trying, what they're really saying is, this matters enough for me to struggle through it instead of walking away from it. And struggle in this context is not a weakness, it's evidence of internal change. Now, this doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean they'll suddenly become emotionally fluent or consistently expressive. Growth in avoidance is rarely linear. There will be moments of progress followed by moments of retreat. That's part of the process. But the presence of effort changes the entire dynamic, because effort creates the possibility of expansion. It opens the door to new patterns, new associations, new emotional experiences that slowly begin to replace the old ones. And over time, what once felt unfamiliar can start to feel safe, not because it changed overnight, but because it was approached consistently. Your role in that dynamic is not to force the transformation. It's to recognize it when it's happening, even in subtle forms. It's to understand that trying is not a small thing for someone who is wired to avoid. And when you respond to effort with patience rather than pressure, you reinforce the very behavior you want to see grow. You create an environment where they don't have to choose between connection and self-protection, where both can begin to coexist. Because at the core of it, love is not just a feeling. It's a decision to move towards something, even when every instinct tells you to move away. And for an avoidant, that decision is everything. So when you hear, I'm not used to this, but I'm trying, don't focus on what's missing. Focus on what's being built. Because in their world, effort is not ordinary, it's transformational. And sometimes the clearest sign of love isn't comfort or certainty, it's the quiet, persistent choice to keep showing up anyway. When an avoidant says, you deserve better, but I don't want to let you go, it can sound like a contradiction, and that's because it is. But it's not confusion for the sake of confusion. It's the clearest window you'll get into their internal struggle between self-protection and emotional attachment. On one side, you have their self-perception. Avoidants often carry a quiet belief that they are not equipped for deep, consistent emotional connection. Not because they lack feelings, but because they've spent years suppressing them, managing them, or distancing themselves from situations that demand them. So when they begin to sense that you want closeness, consistency, or emotional availability, they start to feel a sense of comfort and security. Something inside them starts to question whether they can truly meet that standard. That's where you deserve better comes from. It's not always manipulation. In many cases, it's an honest admission of perceived inadequacy. They are measuring themselves against what they think you need. And instead of rising to meet it immediately, their instinct is to disqualify themselves before they can disappoint you. It's a preemptive defense. If they step back first, they don't have to face the risk of failing in real time. But then comes the second part. I don't want to let you go. And that's where everything changes. Because if there were no real emotional investment, they would let you go cleanly, quietly, without resistance. Avoidants are very capable of detaching when something doesn't matter to them. They don't linger in emotional conflict unless there's something at stake. So when they hold both of these statements at the same time, pushing you away while also resisting the loss, it reveals something deeper than words. It reveals attachment that has already formed, even if they don't fully understand it yet. They're essentially saying, I don't believe I'm enough for what you need, but losing you feels worse than confronting that belief. That's a powerful position to be in psychologically, because now they're facing two opposing forces, the fear of inadequacy and the fear of loss. And for the first time, the fear of loss is not automatically losing. This is where emotional depth begins to develop in an avoidant, not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of it when they can no longer escape the fact that someone matters to them in a way that disrupts their usual patterns. Now, it's important to understand what not to do in this moment. If you respond by trying to convince them that they're not enough or by overcompensating to prove your worth, you reinforce the imbalance. And if you respond by accepting their withdrawal without recognizing the emotional conflict behind it, you miss the opportunity to engage with what's actually happening beneath the surface. The key is to hear both sides of the statement, not just the one that triggers your insecurity. You deserve better is their fear speaking. I don't want to let you go is their attachment revealing itself. And your ability to distinguish between those two determines how you navigate the connection. Because what they need in that moment is not pressure to become something they're not ready to be. They need stability. They need to experience that connection doesn't automatically lead to failure or rejection. They need space to reconcile their internal narrative with their emerging emotional reality. And that reconciliation takes time. But the fact that they haven't walked away, that they're still there, still expressing conflict instead of closing off completely means something, is already shifting. They are beginning to question the identity they've built around independence and emotional distance. They are starting to see that connection, while uncomfortable, is also meaningful. And meaning is what makes people stay. So when you hear those words, don't just hear hesitation. Hear the tension between who they believe they are and who they're starting to become. Because real transformation doesn't begin with confidence, it begins with contradiction. And sometimes the strongest form of love isn't expressed through certainty, it's revealed in the refusal to let go. Even when someone doubts they're enough. When an avoidant says, I think about you more than I admit, you're hearing something that rarely makes it to the surface. Not because the feeling is small, but because it's been deliberately contained. Avoidants don't lack emotion, they manage it. They compartmentalize it, minimize it, and often keep it out of reach, even from themselves. So when that kind of sentence slips through, it's not casual. It's a controlled truth that, for a moment, escaped control. You have to understand how their internal world operates. Avoidants are highly skilled at maintaining distance, not just physically, but mentally. They can be present with you and still hold a part of themselves back. They can feel something deeply and at the same time convince themselves it's not that significant. This isn't deception in the traditional sense, it's regulation. It's how they've learned to stay safe. But here's the paradox. What is suppressed doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Thoughts don't vanish simply because they're unspoken. Feelings don't weaken just because they're hidden. In many cases, they intensify. They grow in private without the relief of expression, without the clarity that comes from being shared. And over time, that internal pressure creates moments where the truth surfaces briefly, carefully, but honestly. I think about you more than I admit is one of those moments. What they're really telling you is that you've occupied space in their mind that they didn't plan to give. You've crossed into their internal landscape, the one they usually keep protected, structured, and under control. And now, despite their efforts, you're there more often than they're comfortable acknowledging. That's significant because attention for an avoidant is a form of investment. They don't dwell on people lightly. They don't replay conversations, revisit memories, or imagine possibilities unless something has already taken root. And if they're admitting it even partially, it means the internal experience has become too consistent to ignore. But notice the phrasing. More than I admit. There's still restraint. There's still a boundary around how much they're willing to reveal. And that's important because it tells you they're not fully ready to externalize everything they feel. They're testing the waters. They're offering a glimpse, not the full picture. And that's where many people make a mistake. They hear that admission and immediately try to pull more out of it, to expand it, to define it, to turn it into something concrete. But pressure at that moment can cause the opposite effect. It can push them back into containment, back into silence. Because for them, expression is not just about honesty, it's about safety. When they share something internal, they're not just communicating, they're exposing a part of themselves that hasn't been fully processed yet. And if that exposure is met with intensity, expectation, or demand, it reinforces the idea that openness leads to overwhelm. But when it's met with understanding, when it's received without interrogation, it creates a different association. It shows them that they can reveal something real without losing control of the situation. And that's how trust begins to build. You see, love in an avoidant doesn't always announce itself loudly. It doesn't always come with grand declarations or consistent reassurance. Sometimes it shows up in fragments and quiet admissions, in subtle shifts, in moments where the internal world briefly becomes visible. This is one of those moments. It's not the full expression of what they feel, but it's evidence that what they feel is growing beyond what they can comfortably contain. And that matters, because once something reaches that point, once it starts to move from silent experience to spoken reality, it becomes harder to suppress. It begins to integrate. It starts to shape behavior, attention, and eventually action. So when you hear, "I think about you more than I admit," don't dismiss it as vague or incomplete. Recognize it for what it is, a controlled release of something much deeper. Because in their world, what is admitted is only a fraction of what is real. And sometimes the most honest insight into someone's feelings isn't found in what they openly declare, but in what they carefully allow you to see. When an avoidant says, "I'm scared of getting too close," you're not hearing a rejection, you're hearing the truth before the defense has time to take over. And that distinction matters because most people only ever experience the defense. They feel the distance, the withdrawal, the sudden shift in energy, but they never get access to the fear that caused it. Here, the fear is being named. Avoidants don't typically verbalize vulnerability in real time. Their instinct is to manage it internally, to create space, to regain control without drawing attention to what's happening beneath the surface. So when someone breaks that pattern and actually says, "I'm scared," they're doing something profoundly unfamiliar. They're choosing exposure over protection, at least for a moment. Now, understand what that fear represents. It's not just fear of you, it's fear of what closeness does to them. Closeness challenges their autonomy. It introduces unpredictability. It activates old associations moments where emotional dependence led to disappointment, pressure, or a loss of self. So as connection deepens, their system doesn't just register warmth, it registers risk. And for most avoidants, that risk is enough to trigger withdrawal. But in this case, something different is happening. Instead of acting on the fear automatically, they're pausing long enough to articulate it. They're allowing you to see the mechanism, not just the outcome. And that level of awareness is not accidental, it's developed. They're essentially saying, "This is affecting me in a way I don't fully know how to handle." That's not weakness, that's clarity. Because fear only shows up where something meaningful exists. You don't fear closeness with people who don't matter. You don't hesitate at the edge of something that has no emotional weight. The presence of fear is evidence that the connection has crossed a threshold from casual interaction into personal significance. And significance changes the rules. Now, their usual strategies, distance, distraction, detachment don't work as cleanly as they used to. Because part of them doesn't want to lose what's forming. So instead of disappearing, they hover. They stay close enough to feel it, but far enough to manage it. And in rare moments like this one, they speak it. "I'm scared of getting too close." What they're revealing is not a lack of desire for connection, but a lack of confidence in their ability to sustain it. They're questioning whether they can remain themselves while also being emotionally available. They're unsure if closeness will enhance their life or destabilize it. And that uncertainty creates tension. Now, if you respond to that tension with urgency, trying to pull them closer, demanding reassurance, or interpreting their fear as a problem to fix you, amplify the very pressure they're trying to avoid. You turn their moment of honesty into a reason to retreat. But if you recognize it for what it is, a sign of emerging trust, you approach it differently. You don't dismiss the fear, and you don't try to eliminate it. You allow it to exist without letting it dictate the entire dynamic. You remain grounded, consistent, and clear in your own presence. And in doing so, you offer something they're not used to: connection without immediate consequence. Because what they need in that moment is not proof that closeness is perfect. They need evidence that it's manageable, that it doesn't have to lead to loss of control, that it doesn't require them to abandon themselves, that it can unfold without overwhelming them. And that evidence doesn't come from words, it comes from experience over time. So when they say they're scared, listen carefully, not just to the fear, but to the fact that they trusted you enough to reveal it. That trust is not given lightly. It's built slowly, often unconsciously, through repeated interactions that feel safe. And now, for a moment, you're seeing the result. Because real connection isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to stay present in spite of it. And when someone who is wired to avoid closeness chooses to admit they're afraid of it, what they're really showing you is this: you've become something worth being afraid to lose. When an avoidant says, I don't want anyone else, just you have to pause and really understand what that means coming from someone whose identity has been built around independence. This is not a personality type that naturally gravitates toward exclusivity. Avoidants value space, autonomy, and emotional self-sufficiency. They don't rush into attachment, and they certainly don't center their world around another person without a significant internal shift. So when they narrow their focus, when they consciously or unconsciously choose you over all other options, it's not casual. It's a decision that runs against their default settings. Because for an avoidant, keeping options open feels safe. It preserves distance. It prevents overinvestment. It allows them to engage without feeling trapped. So to move away from that, to say, in essence, I'm choosing one person, requires more than attraction. It requires trust. And more importantly, it requires emotional significance. Now, that doesn't mean they'll express this choice in the same way someone more emotionally expressive would. You won't always get grand declarations or consistent reassurance. In fact, the way they show it may still feel restrained, even minimal at times. But the underlying shift is what matters. They're no longer relating to you as one of many possibilities. They're relating to you as the priority. And that changes everything, because once an avoidant assigns that level of importance, their internal system has to adapt. The strategies that once kept them comfortable, detachment, emotional distance, casual engagement, start to feel insufficient. They begin to experience something unfamiliar: responsibility toward the connection. Not obligation in the traditional sense, but an awareness that their actions now carry weight, that what they do or don't do affects someone they've come to value. And that awareness can be both grounding and unsettling. So when they say, I don't want anyone else, just you, it's not just a statement of preference. It's a reflection of that internal shift. It's them acknowledging in their own way that the connection has moved beyond convenience into something intentional. They are choosing focus over freedom. And for someone who has spent most of their life protecting their freedom, that's significant. Now, it's important to stay grounded in what this does and doesn't mean. It doesn't mean they've suddenly resolved all their avoidant tendencies. It doesn't mean they'll never need space again, or that they'll immediately become consistent in ways you might expect. Patterns don't disappear overnight, but it does mean that their orientation has changed. They're no longer looking outward. They're looking toward you. And that shift creates the potential for depth, because exclusivity in this context isn't about restriction, it's about investment. It's about directing energy, attention, and emotional bandwidth into one connection instead of dispersing it across many. That's where real intimacy has the chance to grow. But like everything else with an avoidant, it has to be handled with awareness. If exclusivity is met with pressure, with demands for immediate emotional expansion, it can trigger the very defenses that this shift is trying to move beyond. But if it's met with stability, with a grounded presence that doesn't rush the process, it reinforces the idea that commitment doesn't equal loss of self. And that's the lesson they need to learn. Because at the core of avoidance is the belief that closeness will cost them their independence. That to be fully connected means to be confined. And when they begin to choose someone consistently, they are testing whether that belief is actually true. Your role is not to prove them wrong with words. It's to embody a dynamic where connection and individuality can coexist, where choosing someone doesn't mean losing yourself. And when that experience becomes real, for them not theoretical, not promised, but lived, they begin to relax into the connection in a way that wasn't possible before. So when you hear, I don't want anyone else, just you, don't measure it by how perfectly it's expressed. Measure it by what it represents. A shift from detachment to direction, from avoidance to intention. Because in the world of someone who has spent their life avoiding emotional dependency, choosing one person is not a small gesture. It's a turning point. And sometimes the clearest sign of love isn't how loudly someone expresses it, but how deliberately they choose you. Again and again, when every part of them once believed they never would. At the end of the day, what you've just seen is a completely different language of love one that doesn't always sound romantic, doesn't always feel secure, and rarely shows up in perfect, polished words. An avoidant won't love you in obvious ways at first. They won't always reassure you, chase you, or express themselves with emotional fluency. In fact, if you're waiting for traditional signs, you'll miss what's actually happening beneath the surface. Because their love is not built on comfort, it's built on contradiction. It's in the moment they say they need space, but still hold on. It's in the effort they make, even when it feels unnatural. It's in the conflict between pushing you away and not wanting to lose you. It's in the thoughts they hide, the fears they admit, and the choice to focus on you despite their instinct to stay free. This is not a love that announces itself loudly. It's a love that reveals itself slowly through resistance, through tension, through small but meaningful breaks in their own patterns. And if you don't understand that, you'll misread it. You'll take distance as disinterest. You'll take hesitation as lack of feeling. You'll take silence as absence. But once you see it clearly, everything changes. You stop reacting to the surface and you start recognizing the depth. You stop chasing certainty and you start observing consistency. You stop forcing connection and you start allowing it to grow in a way that's actually sustainable. Because real connection, especially with someone who fears it, is not about intensity. It's about stability. It's about creating an environment where love doesn't feel like a threat, but something that can exist without losing control. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Love is not always shown in the way you prefer, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. The question is not just whether they love you. The question is whether you have the awareness to recognize it in a form that doesn't look familiar. Because when you do, you stop trying to force love into your definition and you start understanding it in theirs. And sometimes the deepest kind of love you'll ever experience is the one that had to fight its own nature just to stay.